The Scarlet Forest is the first place in Wilds where the land feels like it's speaking to you in a language older than the Guild. You step out of the windward plains, still carrying that open sky rhythm in your bones, and suddenly the world closes in. The air is thicker. The canopy doesn't just shade you, it encloses you, like you've walked into the inside of something living. The ground is soft in ways you can feel through your boots. Water is everywhere, not as a scenic detail, but as the main actor in the biome. It decides where you can run, where you can fight, where herds can breathe. Even in calm phases, you can tell this forest isn't built around land, it's built around floods. And then the water changes color. One phase it's clear enough to see the roots and fish, the next phase it turns crimson. Not a faint rust tint, not a little muddy runoff, but a full basin-wide red that makes rivers, pools and marshes look like the forest has started bleeding. The game doesn't stop to explain it. Nobody hands you a neat lore note that says, here is why the water is red. It just happens, like a fact the Scarlet Forest has always carried. But in the Forbidden Lands, always is a trick word. We already know this region isn't a normal wilderness. It's the remains of a machine world. The Evertorch still pushes energy through the landspine. Wilk still leaks. Weather phases still flip like a program that never learned to stop. Keystone apexes still rise and fall under that pulse. Guardian constructs still wake on blind loops. So when a whole biome turns its blood on and off in rhythm, it isn't decoration. It's a symptom. Tonight, that's our puzzle. Why does the Scarlet Forest water turn red? And what ancient event is this forest still trying to process every time the phase cycles roll over? Because if the plains were the first tremor in the land's heartbeat, the Scarlet Forest feels like the first bruise. The place where the old system is hurting loudest in the present. Before we go any deeper, quick and genuinely appreciated note, if you're enjoying this long-form Wild series and you want these episodes to keep coming in full length, a like and a subscribe help a ton. It tells YouTube this kind of deep lore storytelling is worth surfacing, and it keeps the series alive in the algorithm. And drop a comment with what other games or worlds you want explored like this after Wilds, because I'm building the next arcs right now, and your picks shape that roadmap more than anything else. All right, back to the red water. Let's anchor ourselves in what the game shows, because Wilds is careful to make the Scarlet Forest feel readable as a place before it asks you to question it. Structurally, this biome is a basin. You can sense that from your first hunts. The ridges are higher around the edges, and as you move inward, everything slopes toward low-lying, swampy pockets. Water doesn't just flow through here, it collects here. It lingers. It builds. The forest is a bowl that holds whatever the sky and the ground decide to pour into it. In fallow, the basin feels tense and slightly sick. The water recedes and leaves behind exposed mud flats. Some channels narrow into sluggish streams. Predators patrol more widely because prey has fewer safe crossings. Herds cling to higher ground and move earlier than you'd expect, like they're already listening for the next shift. The color palette dries out. You get that familiar Wilds feeling of a world holding its breath. Then inclemency hits, and the forest doesn't just get wetter, it reorganizes. Rain comes in sheets, and the basin fills in a pattern that's too consistent to ignore. The lowlands flood first, certain channels swell hard, while others remain oddly steady. Tree roots that were exposed a phase ago disappear under fast, dark water. You start memorizing which ridges stay dry, which hollows always become traps, which narrow valleys turn into rivers you can't cross without fighting the current. The forest is teaching you a routine. Then plenty comes and the biome blooms. Water is abundant without being violent. It clears. It feeds everything. Herds return to grazing zones that were empty in storms. Insects rise in clouds. Plants you couldn't harvest in fallow are suddenly everywhere. Even the predators shift their posture, less frantic, more confident, as if they know this is the world's good season. So far, that's a clean Wilds loop. Scarcity, pressure, abundance. It's the same 3-beat breathing pattern we see everywhere else. But the Scarlet Forest adds a fourth voice into that rhythm. It adds the red water state. What's important is how the red state behaves. The water doesn't turn red in scattered puddles. It changes at scale. Rivers, pools, and floodplains take on the same crimson hue together, like a tide that has moved through the basin. You'll watch one tributary after another darken until the entire lowland reads as one bloody system. It doesn't look like a random spill. It looks like a mode the forest clicks into, same as a storm phase clicks in. Even the way the red water arrives feels synced to the wider cycle, not like a separate local oddity. So the first hard observation is simple. The red water is phase-linked and basin-wide. It's systemic. That alone is enough to raise the real question. What kind of trigger can recolor an entire biome's water network on a schedule? In a normal Monster Hunter region, there are a few answers you might reach for. Maybe it's an alga bloom. Maybe it's iron-rich runoff from a nearby cliff. Maybe some monster bleeds a pigment into the rivers when it migrates through. Those answers work for a one-off. They don't work for a synchronized, repeating state that aligns with the Forbidden Land's broader pulse. Here, there's a much bigger candidate, Wilk and landspine flow. We already know the landspine isn't just veins of stone. It's an energy artery system. When pressure in the grid rises, Wilk leaks out. It settles into soil, air, and water. It changes fertility. It changes monster behavior. It creates the too much life at once phenomenon that plenty thrives on, and the too much pressure at once phenomenon that storms vent. Wilk is the medium through which Wyveria's old machine still speaks. A basin filled with water is the perfect place for that medium to pool. If a surge of Wilk enters a basin, water is where it will show first and strongest. Water in a bowl is a stamp pad for whatever the grid is leaking. You don't need a character to say, "This is Wilk saturation," for the implication to follow naturally. The Scarlet Forest is shaped to reveal energy changes through water, so that gives us a strong second observation. Red water is almost certainly a visible sign of a Wilk surge saturating the basin's waterways. But mechanism isn't meaning. In wilds, the reason something happens is usually hidden in what happens next. So we should watch what the forest does during red water. The moment red water appears, monster behavior shifts. You feel it in the hunt before you understand it in your head. Scavengers become bolder around the floodplains. Medium predators patrol closer to water edges than they do in clear phases. Like the red state has turned the lowlands into a rich feeding zone. Apex tension spikes. You'll see territorial posturing flare up at the boundaries where red water meets higher dry ground. Herds alter routes, avoiding certain crossings entirely, bunching in safer corridors that were fine in plenty but feel suicidal now. It's as if the basin has become a pressure cooker again, but not through storms this time, through chemistry. That's another hard observation. Red water is not neutral. It's a stress phase that reshapes dominance contests and survival routes. Now we're holding 3 core beats in our hands. A repeating basin-wide red water state, likely driven by Wilk surge, that functions as a pressure event for ecology. That's enough to build a theory, but before we do, let's gather the smaller, quieter clues wilds plants around the forest. Because those are what tell us this red state isn't just generic Wilk in water, but a specifically Scarlet Forest legacy. Look at where Wyverian ruins sit here, not safely on hilltops, not as isolated towers for the camera to admire. They are embedded in and around floodplains, half-submerged platforms, and cracked channels that look like they were designed to move water in deliberate directions. You aren't walking through ancient rubble. You're walking through waterworks, old stone corridors that feel like spillways, terraces that suggest controlled flooding, whole sections of geography that look less like nature carving a basin over millennia and more like engineering shaping a basin for a purpose. And this purpose mattered enough that those structures still guide how water moves even now. During inclemency, you can watch floodwater follow lines that coincide with old stone paths. Certain hollows fill first as if they're part of a planned flood map. Certain ridges stay dry as if they were meant to be refugees. It feels like a reservoir with outdated controls still doing its old routine. Another quiet clue is how some species in the forest seem adapted specifically to the red state. Not just they can fight in bad conditions, they behave like the red water is a resource event. Predators linger at red pools as if they've learned those pools draw prey. Smaller life clusters in patterns that suggest the red phase changes what grows or decays in the water. You get the sense that the red state isn't new. It's old enough for biology to have arranged itself around it. Put those smaller clues together and the Scarlet Forest starts to look like a designed basin within Wyveria's machine. Not just an area powered by the grid, but an organ of the grid. A place where energy and water were meant to cooperate. Now we can step into history, because red water that repeats like a designed purge implies a designed problem it was meant to solve. Wyveria's empire changed its world by injecting infinite bioenergy into nature. That's the defining act of the Forbidden Land's past. The Dragon Torch didn't just power cities, it powered life. It accelerated fertility, shifted climates, and forced apex hierarchies into constant motion. That allowed Wyveria to build a stable civilization on top of massive ecological throughput. But a managed ecosystem is always dancing on a line. The more energy you push into it, the more you risk runaway bloom. And nowhere is runaway bloom more dangerous than in a forest basin. Forests are biological sponges. They trap moisture, biomass, and heat. A basin forest traps even more because everything sinks into it and struggles to leave. If Wyveria pumped energy into a basin like this, it would become a pressure hub. Plants would overgrow faster than grazers could consume. Herbivore populations would spike and then crash. Predators would surge to follow the spike. Apex contests would intensify. Energy would concentrate into the top of the food web more aggressively than in open regions like the plains. You can imagine Wyveria planning for this. A civilization that built a continent-scale grid wouldn't neglect its hottest biological reservoir. If they designed this forest as part of the system, they designed a valve for it too. What does a valve look like in a basin? It looks like a purge. A controlled flush of excess energy and biomass through water. If you periodically saturate a basin with a high-energy flood, you can cull overgrowth, destabilize dominance long enough to prevent any one apex from locking in, and then follow it with a recovery window where life regrows evenly. It's brutal, but it's effective. It's the ecological equivalent of a controlled burn in a forest, except here the burn is chemical and energetic, carried by water instead of flame. That's why Scarlet Forest doesn't just have storms as its pressure state. It has red water as a second, more specific pressure state. The storms vent dominance through violence across the surface. The red flood vents dominance through the basin's internal medium. It is a reset targeted at the forest's unique risk: hoarding. So here's the clean logic. Wyveria's stabilizer needed an extra purge routine for this basin because the basin was too good at trapping energy, and that gives us the episode's reveal. The Scarlet Forest's red waters are a legacy purge phase in Wyveria's stabilizer, a system-wide Wilk flood designed to vent accumulated bioenergy from the basin, break dominance hoarding, and prevent runaway ecological overload. In the present, with the land spine damaged and energy spiking unevenly, that purge fires too hard and too unstable, turning a former safety routine into a recurring wound the forest keeps reopening. Now let's test this theory against everything we actually feel in the biome, because a good Monster Hunter theory has to ride cleanly through lived gameplay. When the red water hits, prey routes change sharply. That makes sense if the state is lethal or destabilizing to certain organisms. In a purge flood, lower-tier species are the first to suffer. Their flight creates chaotic prey migration, which then spikes predator movement, which then ignites apex contests. You see that chain play out in real time during red phases. Resources surfacing also fits. Plenty already looks like an energy fertilization phase across the Forbidden Lands. If red water is a purge, the next plenty is a rebound. A purge flood could strip biomass, redistribute minerals, and then when energy stabilizes again, the basin blooms hard. That's why the forest can swing from sickly to lush so quickly. It isn't natural seasonal variation, it's a system dumping and refilling a reservoir. Even the ruins fit. They are where they would be for engineers managing flood timing and energy saturation in the lowlands, around channels, as if they once monitored and shaped the basin's cycles. You can't walk through the Scarlet Forest without stepping on the literal infrastructure of its old purge routine. The present-day monsters fit too. Species adapted to feast on chaos would thrive in a purge state. Apexes designed for territorial aggression in tight, low-visibility zones would get windows to rise. When the red flood arrives, it is selecting winners the same way inclemency does in open biomes, just through a different tool. So the theory doesn't fight the game. It explains it. Nah. But there's a deeper reason this matters, and it's the reason this episode should feel heavier than a quick, cool biome trivia breakdown. Because if the red flood is a purge routine, then the severity of that purge tells you how close the basin is to failing its stabilizer loop. Starts simple. During Wyveria's height, this purge would have been calibrated. It would come when energy buildup hit a safe threshold. It would last only long enough to vent pressure. It would then yield to plenty with predictable timing. The basin would never be allowed to hoard too much energy for long. It would remain resilient. Now, remember the present. The land spine is damaged. Wilk leaks in bursts, not streams. The storms are harsher. Plenty windows can feel shorter. Arkveld's regulator has awakened without guidance, trimming apexes bluntly. and creating vacuums. Every one of those factors increases basin instability, so the purge routine has to work harder to keep up. That means more wilk floods, deeper saturation, red phases that feel longer or more violent. The forest starts purging not because it wants to, but because it must to keep itself from locking into runaway dominance. In a body, that's a fever trying to keep infection in check. In a machine world, it's a stabilizer screaming to hold the line. And every time you see those waters bleed, you're seeing the line strain. That is a crucial difference from the plains. Plains storms intensify to shuffle dominance in an open hall. Scarlet forest red floods intensify because the basin is in danger of becoming an energy sink too large for the system to vent. This makes the scarlet forest a diagnostic organ for the whole Forbidden Lands. It's the place where system pressure shows most starkly. Now, let's bring the keepers back in, because they add the human layer to what would otherwise be a purely ecological mystery. The keepers survived 2,000 years here. That is not a footnote. It is a staggering fact that explains why their culture is what it is. A people living in a forest that periodically undergoes lethal red floods doesn't survive by luck. They survive by building life around purge timing. They cache food in fallow. They evacuate lowlands in advance. They steer herds with chimes away from flood funnels. Their villages are placed on ridges that stay dry even when the basin is in full purge. Their rituals are timed to phases not because they're romantic, but because phases are survival math. And more importantly, they learn to live without tapping the grid. They don't harvest wilk as fuel. They don't build around Evertorch dependence. In a basin where too much energy can literally turn your rivers into a purge flood, energy dependence isn't progress. It's temptation toward collapse. So the Scarlet Forest is part of why the Keepers became post-Wyverian humans. You don't need a plaque that says, "We renounce the old ways." You only need a red river that shows you what the old ways cost. This circles us back to the season's big spine. Wyveria fell because a feedback spiral got out of control. Energy surges fed dominance. Dominance hoarded energy. Resets grew harsher. And finally, Zoshia emerged as the doomsday culmination. Arkveld was made to stop that spiral at the apex level. Phase storms were made to stop it at the climate level. Purge floods, like the Scarlet Forest's red water, were made to stop it at the basin level. These are all layers of the same stabilizer, and all of them are now misfiring. So Episode 6's aftershock is this. The Scarlet Forest isn't just a pretty biome with a spooky gimmick. It's the clearest present-day warning that the ancient stabilizer is failing to contain the Forbidden Lands' energy spiral. When the plains become harsher, that's a stress signal. When Arkveld wakes, that's a stress signal. When Guardian constructs surface, that's a stress signal. When a purge basin starts bleeding more violently, that's the system telling you it's reaching for stronger and stronger corrections. In other words, red water is not flavor. It's a countdown. Now, a fair counter-reading exists here, and it's worth addressing so your audience trusts the lens. You could argue the red water is purely natural. Iron blooms, algae cycles, mineral runoff from hidden cliffs. In a world full of elemental life, red rivers could be an exaggerated version of real mineralized basins. You could say Wyveria's ruins just happen to be built near water because humans always build near water, and the cycle is just a quirky local season. That reading works if you isolate the forest. It struggles when you place the forest inside the machine world context we've built. The red water is phase-linked in timing with the continent's broader stabilizer rhythm. It has direct ecological pressure effects that match the stabilizer's logic elsewhere. And the Scarlet Forest is visibly wired into old water management infrastructure that behaves like a designed reservoir still following a program. So maybe nature supplied the raw materials for red floods, but Wyveria's grid made them systemic, and the system's damage made them violent again. Once you accept that, the Scarlet Forest becomes one of the most important story locations in Wilds, not because it hides a single monster secret, but because it shows you what the land's immune response looks like when it's scared. Now, we're ready to bridge forward. We ended Episode 5 by asking what happens when the Apex system accelerates toward a reset threshold. Episode 6 gives us part of that answer. The stabilizer is already purging harder at the biome level. The question now is, what's driving that escalation right now in the present? Is it just accumulated energy from harsher storm seasons? Is Arkveld's blunt trimming creating vacuums faster than basins can recover? Or is something deeper in the grid waking and feeding? Something that forces the system to flush energy because it senses a more catastrophic imbalance building below?